Alright, I'm about to ask a question that probably not very many of you could answer comfortably. And that is, was Jesus of Nazareth a real person? Before I continue into, briefly over the speech, I will be discussing some of the evidence to support whether or not that is the case. Alright, before I go into my speech, I'm going to give a quick testimony. I was raised in a Christian home and became a Christian at the age of 7. And pretty much I accepted everything I had been told from the church, just without question. And really about the time that I graduated high school, I started realizing, hey, the only thing I know about my faith is based completely on everything I've heard from this one source. So that really caused a lot of doubts. And I decided that I was going to step back and try to take an objective and unbiased look at history and life, Christianity's. So I started considering secular sources and Christian sources and comparing facts. And specifically on this topic of whether or not Jesus was a real person, I found a lot of interesting information, and I would like to share that very quickly. And that specifically, I'm going to be going over the ancient manuscripts that reference Jesus, the reliability of the New Testament for this specific topic, and also some modern expert scholar testimony. And before I do that, I'm going to run over this quick analogy. This was Alexander the Great. And really, we only have about 5 ancient historical sources on Alexander the Great. That's my laser. And they were all thought to be written about 300 years after he died. Really, historians believe that he existed mainly because of his impact on history. So that's just something to take into consideration. Here I have some historically significant, ancient, non-biblical evidence for Jesus Christ. Or Jesus of Nazareth. I'm not going to run over all these specifically, but I just want to read a couple of important ones. This one is from the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who says, "At this time there was a man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified, and he died. And those who became his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he appeared to them 3 days later after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was thought to be the Messiah." And this was a typical, unbiased, just an objective look at what was going on historically at the time. He uses disclaimer phrases like "they reported" and "he was thought" in his testimony, which was pretty consistent with other historians at the time. Tacitus was considered to be one of the greatest, earliest Roman historians, if not the greatest, and he said that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, that Jesus' teachings had already spread to Rome, and that Christians were considered criminals and tortured in a variety of ways, including crucifixion. And Roman historian Suetonius wrote of Jesus being an instigator, and wrote that Christians were commonly tortured by Nero. And I think this is an interesting point to the subject. There are several recordings of people from the early Christian church who were being badly tortured and even executed in some case. And simply, I don't believe this would be a factor if they weren't absolutely sure they were following a real person. And like I said, there are several other reports. These are just some major ones, and I'm not going to go over all of them because I definitely do not have time. Next, I'm going to talk about the reliability of New Testament sources. And according to Michael Grant, a historian, says in his book that even most non-Christian historians consider ancient New Testament manuscripts as solid evidence for Jesus' existence. Now, it's not saying that most non-Christians accept the New Testament at face value and that they believe everything is true. Simply, non-Christian historians consider the New Testament manuscripts as solid evidence for the very existence of Jesus. Not the deity or anything like that, but for the existence. There are several very important biblical writers, such as Luke, that really give us an interesting picture into secular culture and history that we would not have outside of this New Testament writings. And despite the Roman invasion of Jerusalem in the first century, we actually still have a massive amount of original New Testament manuscripts, which really speaks to the credibility of the New Testament. In this chart, it's just illustrated. These are some very popular historical manuscripts. And we have known about 5,600 surviving copies of the original New Testament manuscripts. And they varied only by about 0.05%. And these variances were mostly misspellings. It was nothing significant to the actual content. Briefly, I'm just going to go over some modern historian testimony. Historical scholar F.F. Bruce, who was an ambassador for a few different nations and an authority on the subject, said the historicity of Christ is as axiomatic for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar. Scholar Shlomo Pines, that's a cool name, says that even the most bitter opponents of Christianity never expressed any doubts as to Jesus having really existed. Similar to world historian Will Durant, saying no Jew or Gentile from the first century ever denied the existence of Jesus. And there was plenty of opposition writing in the first century about Jesus, but really none of it tried to deny the existence of Jesus, because what was the point? There are so many eyewitnesses, so many manuscripts and whatnot. They tried to combat the deity of Jesus, the teachings, but never the existence. So just real fast, I put together a soundbite. You may or may not have heard of the two people, but they're both very famous historians, authority on the topic and whatnot.
I don't think there's any serious historian who doubts the existence of Jesus.
When you look at history, let's leave aside, maybe I alluded to the possibility that some historians think Jesus never exists. I take that back. Jesus existed.
We have to ask ourselves, are we prepared to believe in historical testimony or not?
All right, are we prepared to believe in historical testimony? Was Jesus of Nazareth a real person? You know, really, I think there's a tremendous amount of evidence to support. I mean, for this period of time, most people, I mean, really only the major, I guess, rulers of the time, political figures, war heroes, were documented to anywhere near this magnitude, and most of them not even as much. I think if we set aside any biases that we might have, and we look at the historical manuscripts and the reliability, consistency of the New Testament, I think it's actually pretty hard to dispute the claims of so many modern historians and scholars. So basically, I've provided you all with as much information as I could pack into 6 minutes, and what you do with this information is up for you to decide.